Hello, good people of YouTube. Mountbatten here, and today we are discussing a ship that I forgot just how good, how sweet this ship is until recently, because I really haven't played it in any consistent manner in the past 3 or 4 years easily. It's a ship that's been brought up more and more on the channel for a particular reason. We'll get to that here in a second. And because of that, I've been playing it a bit more. We sat down to play here on the live stream last night, and I had a great game in the ship. And I thought, you know what, let's give this ship its own standalone video. She really deserves it. And that is the Tier 8 American Techline Battleship, the North Carolina. I remember the days when there was only one battleship line you could go up with the American tech tree, and well, the North Carolina was and is the Tier 8 ship. Now, of course, she's been brought up more recently because I went to the real North Carolina. You can check that video out here. It'll pop up on the screen. And of course, well, that brings attention to the ship in game, right? And you know, this ship back in the day, this was the reward for getting through the Colorado, right? Because you newer players, you guys have the buffed Colorado with the improved heel and all that jazz. Back in the day, oh my god, the Colorado sucked, and many suffer with it today, but it was so much worse back then. And then finally, after being stuck with the Colorado, stuck to a 20-knot top speed, you get the North Carolina. You can go 28 knots now, which isn't overly fast by Tier 8 standards, even back in the day, and especially today, right? But my god, you could go fast. You had a modern ship. It wasn't this big, huge, chunky target. You've got, you know, the traditional gun layout. It looks like an Iowa, and you're almost there to the Iowa. And when I first got this ship, it gets you into a lot of trouble. Got me into a lot of trouble, as I'm sure it gets a lot of you guys into a lot of trouble once you get through the Colorado, because of course you want to just smash W and fly, right? Because you've been stuck to a 20-knot top speed. You've been a tortoise, and now you're the rabbit, right? So what happens with the North Carolina is once you do get to that and you do smack W, you go into the front lines of the Tier 10 game, you're up Tier 2, and you die. Because the North Carolina has some very thin armor, which is true to its, you know, it's a historical design, because she was a treaty battleship. She was originally supposed to be armed with 12 14-inch guns, but thanks to the escalated clause in the naval treaty, she was able to be equipped with the 9 16-inch guns that we have on her in game. If you want to see something like she was supposed to be, that's the Florida, the Tier 7 American battleship. But this is the version that we got in real life and in game. So why is this ship so good? Well, really, it's all in her guns. She has 9 16-inch guns. They are 406 millimeters in the non-American measurement, and they get that sweet, sweet American Mark 8 super heavy AP. Now, like many of the American ships in this game, there's of course a trade-off for having that sweet, sweet American AP. And that is of course the shell flight time. I've talked about this plenty of times because of the short barrels of the North Carolina and the weight of the Mark 8 AP shell. The AP shells pretty much like just fall out of the barrel at their initial speed of 701 meters a second. When you get to the Iowa, you get the longer barrel. It's a 50 caliber barrel versus the 45 caliber barrel of the North Carolina. So you get a little more velocity there with the Iowa. It's a little bit easier to, of course, aim. But with that 701 meters a second initial speed, yeah, those shells aren't going anywhere anytime soon, right? And of course, the longer range, because of the terrible air drag, it just takes forever to get to where you're going. And that's something that you have to deal with from, you know, the entirety of the American battleship. Well, the upper half of the American battleship line, at least. So it gets you ready for what's to come. But of course, what that means in game is that at longer ranges, it's a lot more difficult to get those shells to land on target. You have to give them a much larger lead, and you have to be able to predict their movements that far out. So you don't want to be sniping in the ship either. You really want to be playing her at mid-range, which is what's been happening to me here more recently. In the recent days, I've been able to get into a lot more of those mid-range engagements, and with the match watching in the background, a good chunk of the match was at mid-range, which is just a sweet zone for these American battleships, for the Iowa and the Montana. in the North Carolina, that, like 12, 13-ish kilometers range, where you can still safely angle your ship, and where your shells, the slowness of them doesn't really hold them back too much. It's just so freaking sweet when you get into that sweet spot. Now, the North Carolina is a ship that you basically have to forget you have a rear turret because of her armor. Her sides are not well armored, and you can and will get citadeled by anything with just halfway decent AP. Like, there's a lot of heavy cruisers that can just zip right through your broadside armor and just ruin you, especially today with all the the large cruisers we have, like the Stalingrads and stuff, the Aegires, those large cruisers, that they just have this ship for breakfast, right? So what you have to do is just point your bow toward the enemy when you get into those close-in engagements, and just bow tank, which is something that, again, used to happen a lot back in the day. You see all the Iowas and such doing it before the Iowa Citadel got lowered. You point your bow toward the enemy, you bow tank, you go forward, you go back, you do the little Iowa dance, right? Just going forward and back for, 5 minutes until something happens. And when you're able to do that at, medium range, it's kind of bringing back memories of old. At least this match in the background was when I was doing that later in the game. I was like, man, it feels like it's 2018 all over again, right? But yeah, when you're able to do that, the ship is surprisingly tanky because, again, you don't have the massive superstructure of the dreadnoughts, right? You have a more slimmed down superstructure, and that's great, of course, when it comes to that. And two, what the slow shells also allow you to do is bully lighter armored targets a lot better than battleships that have those faster velocity shells. So with the high velocity shells, like the French shells, for example, you overpin so much stuff with those French shells. And if you play like the Alsace or the Republique, or again any of the French battleships with larger caliber guns, you just zip through everything. But because the shells are going so slow with the North Carolina, they will more often than not actually pin what you're aiming at, and thereby do more damage. So when you're in those mid-range engagements dealing with lighter armored targets like cruisers or like aircraft carriers, like I caught it out in the open here, it's just a dream, right? And then the shells are still meaty enough to when you do have to deal with heavily armored targets, they of course have that punch because they are the super heavy AP shells, and they really hit like 17 or 18-inch shells. I mean, the maximum damage is 13,100, and that's only about 1,000 off of the Yammy's maximum damage. The Yammy's maximum damage is 14,800-ish, somewhere in there. So I mean, yeah, the shells have some punch to them. Now, the North Carolina is, of course, just a sign of what's to come with the line once you get up to, like the Iowa and such. But it's just such a nice ship that if you haven't grinded to it yet, I would highly recommend it. It's a free Techline ship, right? Like, you don't have to break out your wallet for it. It's just there for you to grind, and it's a really enjoyable experience. But you do have to watch your side, of course, because again, if you get caught out in the open, you're going to definitely pay for it. But the ship can angle too, right? You really only have to cover your sides if you're seeing like tier 10 ships, ships with the mean AP, like the Soviet battleships, or like if you do run to a Thunderer, definitely watch your side there. Another good thing about the North Carolina is that she does, of course, have better than average AA because she is an American battleship. So when you do have those annoying planes flying around, it's one of the few ships that can actually do a decent bit of damage to them. Unfortunately, like so many other ships that had great AA back in the day, she's not, what she once was, where you could just basically tell the CV to go screw off, right? I miss those days, as I'm sure many of you do as well. In addition to all that too, despite having a top speed of 28 knots, which again by tier 8 standards today is not fast, but definitely not slow, the ship is pretty maneuverable. All the American battleships, until you get to the Iowa, because the ships are so friggin' long, are pretty maneuverable, and they can turn quite well. So when you're dealing with submarines with their guided torpedoes, or even if they're trying to blast you with their unguided torpedoes, or even, of course, like just DD torps, right? The ship can turn pretty reasonably well, and you can get around those torpedoes and dance around them to a decent degree. And I mean, that's something that like the lower tier American ships have going for them. The dreadnoughts are really good at that. They have really small turning circles, so it's nice to see how they kind of blended that in with the high, the higher tier ships with the faster speed there with the North Carolina. So it's a nice little sweet zone that is carried over to the South Dakotas, the Massachusetts and the Alabama. They do the same thing pretty much when it comes to the maneuverability. So that's pretty nice there for them. But again, if you haven't grinded up to the North Carolina yet, I would highly encourage it. It's a nice ship from yesteryear that still holds up pretty well today. Again, I'm not saying it's like the best Tier 8 battleship. I'm not saying it's going to be placing at the top of the leaderboard. But once you get the ship down, you get the aiming down, and you're able to get into those mid-range engagements, which, I mean, like higher tier today, it normally starts off long range and gets to, like the 15-ish kilometer range pretty regularly. So the ship still can do well. It's not like the, like the German battleships or like the Krim, like we were talking about a couple of days ago, where it's just like, oh my God, this ship's almost unplayable because we never get close anymore. The ship, excels around that 15, 16-ish kilometer mark. Of course, if you can get closer to like the 13 or 12 kilometer mark, that is, of course, the absolute sweet zone for the North Carolina. But yeah, if you can grind to it, I'd highly recommend it. Of course, you can get up into the Iowa and the Montana after that. Both ships which have aged incredibly well in my opinion as well. Again, it's just funny how these older lines age well and you still see people playing these lines compared to like some of these newer tech lines that come out and they're popular for a week or two. You don't really see too much of them anymore. Again, I guess it's just what happens when you put a lot of thought into a line and don't depend too much on gimmicks or consumables for your line's identity. Speaking of consumables, ironically, as I mentioned that, the ship did get the improved American Battleship Hill a few years ago. So if you're an older player and you're remembering getting clapped down to a third of your HP in the North Carolina, not being able to recover from that, they did add the improved American Battleship Hill to the North Carolina. So when you do get clapped, you can at least recover a bit more back than what you used to be able to do back in the day. So that's definitely a buff she's gotten over the years that it is certainly helping her. So she's got that, the 2.05 Sigma on the guns, the American Battleship Dispersion. She's got the speed, the maneuverability, decent-ish AA. I mean, yeah, nice little Tier 8 battleship that is aged a lot better than I would have thought in today's World of Warships. So guys, if you enjoyed today's video, make sure to drop a like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel. We're on our way to 75,000 subscribers thanks to you guys, and I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend and a rest of your week if you don't hear from me before then. Hope to catch you guys in the next one.